Millions of soldiers' lives would be saved if insurgent attacks in wars could be predicted. And now a group of American scientists claim it's actually possible to do that. They say the incidents follow an underlying mathematical pattern. Indeed, they've collected data from thousands of attacks in 9 wars, including those in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, Dina Grusovsky is in our DC studio tonight to talk more about this. Dina, let's get to the bottom of this story. An incredible claim on the face of it, isn't it? But just how are these mathematicians, these physicists, backing it up?
Well, really fascinating stuff, Kev. Could terrorist attacks follow the laws of math? Now, researchers at Miami University say they have come up with a mathematical model that could predict these insurgent and terrorist attacks before they occur. One of those researchers, Neil Johnson, he is a professor of physics at that university, and he joins me from Florida today. Mr. Johnson, thank you so much for being here. So first of all, unpredictability is actually one of the hallmarks of a terrorist attack. I mean, really, that's what makes it so frightening. But you say that it's not really so random. So talk about your research. Talk about the formula. What did you come up with here?
Well, that's correct. One would imagine, in fact, you hear on the news all the time these kind of random numbers come out about the number killed, number of casualties in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in a bombing here or there. And it was precisely that question about those numbers that got us started on this research. Is it really random? And looking at these numbers as we have over the past few years, we've begun to see a clear pattern that extends across all of these different conflicts, irrespective if they're in the desert, they're in the mountains. It just seems to be to do with the way in which groups of insurgents fight against a larger state force.
But has this actually been tested in the real world as far as predicting an actual future terrorist attack? Because you will find many people who are skeptical here and say, look, we live in a world where you can't predict a football game, the result of a football game. You can't predict the weather. How in the world are you going to predict something as complex as a terrorist attack?
You're absolutely right. But if you take a little, have a think in everyday life, for example, the traffic jams that we have here in Miami and the traffic jams in Moscow, although, for example, they may be very different places, very different people, different cars, the way in which the patterns of these traffic jams, for example, build up has something in common despite these different places. It's exactly that same kind of common idea that we begin to see, irrespective of what the causes are, who the people are doing it. It's sort of just the way in which people do things that seems to create these patterns that make the numbers that we hear on the news not random. They seem random, but if you take a really close look at them, they're not random.
So, I mean, you've said that your analysis can be used to make predictions, to assess risks in the future. So do you think that the U.S. government is going to sort of take what you found into consideration? And if so, how could this affect strategy in the future, especially if we think about Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a very, very good idea. I mean, we've had a lot of interest, as you can imagine, in this work. We actually started this work back in 2004, and we put out some things in public domain on the web in 2005, showing that at least for Iraq and Afghanistan and Colombia, there seemed to be some common patterns developing, and we postulated then in 2005 that might continue and that might extend to other conflicts. Since 2005, we were kind of inundated with data being sent to us by academics looking at various different kinds of wars, and all of these wars, all of the insurgent wars that we have looked at fall into this pattern, except 2. And those 2 wars are not insurgent. They're the American Civil War and the Spanish Civil War, fought between conventional armies. So you wouldn't expect them to fall into this same pattern.
That's very interesting. So the other ones fall into the same pattern. But speaking of that, you also talk about bringing a third party into the mix, perhaps a peacekeeping mission. When you do that research, what do you expect to change there?
Well, this is very interesting. This is really where I think the research can be very useful. It's for looking at scenarios, future scenarios. I mean, it's very easy for me on the same computer that I'm talking to you now. I can just sit here and put in scenarios for what would happen if one increased or decreased the size of the force fighting an insurgency. It costs me nothing. It's part of the model, and one can actually explore then what would be most effective strategies given certain types of scenarios or constraints. For example, if one was sending in a peacekeeping force, should they themselves be broken up into units that mimic the insurgency? Should they be kept as one large block? Should they be split into two? What are the answers to these questions? We can explore those within this model.
Professor Johnson, I want to thank you for speaking with me about your findings today. Kevin, I'm going to throw it back to you in Moscow, but some really fascinating stuff here, statistics, when it comes to predicting terrorist attacks. Imagine that. Yeah,
interesting concept the professor's coming up with there. It gives more to the adage, doesn't it, that, hey, history repeats itself. Artis Dina Gusovsky in Washington and Neil Johnson in Miami there. Good to see you.